A mother's love is supposed to protect, to shield, nurture, and comfort. But for 18-month-old Ellie Plummer, the woman who should have been her guardian wasn't her savior, she was her executioner. The days leading up to Ellie's final moments were filled with missed warnings, deliberate cruelty, and a system that failed her when she needed it the most. But even as investigators began to piece together what happened behind closed doors, nothing could prepare them for the truth. When Cheyenne Hill walked into the interrogation room, she wasn't panicked. She wasn't grieving. She wasn't even nervous. Instead, she was composed, calculating, rehearsed. At first, she claimed innocence, weaving a tale of a mother doing her best in difficult circumstances. But as detectives pressed further, her mask began to slip. The excuses, the contradictions, the callous detachment, they all pointed to one thing. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was intentional. Premeditated. Chilling. It took 6 days for the world to realize Ellie was in grave danger. 6 days for the warnings to go unheard. 6 days before the unimaginable happened. And when the truth was finally uncovered, even hardened detectives struggled to keep their composure. Would you have seen the warning signs? Would you have intervened in time? Let us know in the comments. This is the story of Cheyenne Hill and the little girl she betrayed. Before we continue, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't. Ellie Plummer had barely begun her life when it was stolen from her. She was only 18 months old, a child who should have been learning her first words, laughing at silly faces, reaching out for the warmth of a loving embrace. Instead, she lived in a world where love was absent, where tenderness was replaced by neglect, and where the one person meant to protect her was the very source of her pain. Those who saw her in the final months before her death recall a child who was quiet, withdrawn, and far too small for her age. She had once been playful, giggling at the simplest things, but as time passed, that light began to fade. Her body bore the signs of a child in distress, bruises scattered across her small frame, a swelling on her forehead that never quite seemed to heal, small arms that flinched when someone reached for her. The signs were there, but they were ignored, dismissed, brushed aside. People noticed. Some asked questions. But when the answers were always the same, she just falls a lot, she bruises easily, she's fine, what more could they do? Some did report what they saw. Calls were made, but no one acted fast enough. And in the end, Ellie was left alone, defenseless, with the one person she needed to be saved from. Cheyenne Hill had never wanted to be a mother. Her pregnancy had been unplanned, and from the moment Ellie was born, she viewed her not as a child, but as an inconvenience. A responsibility she never asked for. A weight that held her back from living the life she wanted. Those who knew Cheyenne describe her as someone who lived without care for the consequences of her actions. She drifted from one relationship to another, surrounded herself with people who enabled her reckless behavior, and used whatever means necessary to escape the reality of her life. Drugs were a constant presence. It wasn't a secret. People who visited her home often smelled the sharp, chemical scent in the air. The signs of addiction were clear: erratic behavior, mood swings, a complete disregard for anything outside of her own desires. Her relationships were just as unstable. Cameron Fluming was her latest boyfriend, a man who, like so many others before him, had seen the signs but done nothing. He was there, in the same home where Ellie suffered, but he never stepped in, never asked too many questions. It was easier to look away. And that was what everyone did. Cheyenne never hid her resentment toward Ellie. She spoke about her daughter with a coldness that unsettled those who heard it. "She's ugly," she would say. "She's weird. She reminds me of Jeffrey Dahmer." To most, this would be an unthinkable thing to say about a child, especially their own. But for Cheyenne, it was just another way to distance herself from the reality that Ellie was her daughter, her responsibility. The more Ellie needed, the more Cheyenne pulled away. She barely fed her. When she did, she threw food onto the floor and made Ellie eat like an animal. She even had a name for it. Free roaming. The bruises on Ellie's body became more frequent, more pronounced. But whenever someone asked, the excuses were always the same. She fell. She's clumsy. She just bruises easily. And eventually, people stopped asking. But there was one person who had seen too much to ignore it, Michelle Merrow, the babysitter. Michelle had been watching Ellie for months, and she had noticed the changes. At first, it had been a few bruises here and there, nothing too alarming. But as time went on, the injuries worsened. Ellie's face looked swollen. The mark on her forehead, which Cheyenne claimed was from a simple fall, hadn't faded the way it should have. It had deepened, stretching from her forehead down to her cheek. Michelle asked questions, but Cheyenne brushed them aside. She's just clumsy, Cheyenne would say. She's always running into things. But Michelle wasn't convinced. She had taken care of plenty of children in her life, and she knew the difference between the scrapes of an active toddler and the kind of injuries that came from something else entirely. She thought about reporting it. She thought about pressing the issue. But Cheyenne always had an excuse, and without clear evidence, there was little she could do. Ellie was getting worse. She wasn't as energetic as she used to be. She was quieter, moving slower, as if her little body had grown too heavy for her to carry. The bruises that once healed had begun to stack on top of each other, new ones forming before the old ones could fade. And then, there was the night before everything changed. Ellie cried out in pain. She wasn't just fussy, not just whining the way tired toddlers sometimes do, this was different. Her cries were sharp, desperate, the kind that made it clear she was hurting. But Cheyenne didn't go to her. She didn't pick her up, didn't check to see what was wrong. She stayed where she was, ignoring the sound, letting it fade into the background like it meant nothing. By the time morning came, Ellie was silent. When Cheyenne went to check on her, she found Ellie lying still. Her tiny chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her face unnaturally pale. She wasn't responding. She wasn't crying anymore. For any normal parent, panic would have set in immediately. A child who had been crying in pain hours before was now eerily quiet and unresponsive. The only logical response would have been to scoop her up, rush her to a hospital, demand that doctors figure out what was wrong. But Cheyenne did none of that. She stared at her daughter's motionless body for a moment, then made a decision that defied all reason. She got ready for work. She gathered her things, stepped over the barely breathing child, and left. Ellie was left alone in the house with Cameron Fluming, a man who had spent months witnessing Cheyenne's neglect without saying a word. But this time, something unsettled him. He could see that Ellie wasn't just tired, wasn't just being fussy. Her small body looked too still, too lifeless. He called Cheyenne at work. "She's not waking up," he told her. "Something's wrong." At first, Cheyenne dismissed him, the same way she had dismissed so many concerns before. But Cameron was persistent. He told her that Ellie needed help. That she should come back. That something wasn't right. She hesitated. Even in that moment, with her daughter barely clinging to life, she hesitated. Maybe it was because she didn't want to leave work. Maybe it was because she knew that once doctors saw Ellie, they would ask questions that she couldn't answer. But eventually, she agreed. She left work, returned home, and finally took Ellie to the hospital. By then, it was far too late. Ellie's small body had already endured more than it could take. The injuries, the trauma, the sheer neglect, there was no coming back from it. The doctors who examined her didn't need long to realize that what they were seeing wasn't the result of a simple accident. This wasn't the outcome of a fall from a bed, as Cheyenne would later claim. Ellie had been battered, broken, and left to suffer in silence. And for the first time, someone did something about it. The authorities were called. The investigation began. And soon, the woman who had ignored her daughter's pain, who had mocked her, belittled her, and treated her like a burden, would have to answer for what she had done. Why do you think some people ignore warning signs when it comes to their children? Share your thoughts. Ellie's suffering was over. But for Cheyenne Hill, the nightmare was just beginning. When the doctors at Riley Hospital for Children examined Ellie Plummer, they immediately knew that this was not the result of an accident. The little girl was unresponsive, her tiny body covered in bruises, her breathing weak. Her skin, usually full of life, had taken on a pale, almost grayish tone. There was no natural explanation for what they were seeing, no innocent mishap that could have caused the sheer extent of her injuries. Her collarbone was broken. Her face was swollen, the bruises scattered across her small frame like the aftermath of repeated impacts. But what concerned them the most was what they couldn't see with their eyes, the severe brain bleed inside her skull. The scans showed signs of blunt force trauma, repeated head injuries, not just one. This had not happened overnight. Medical professionals had seen cases like this before. They knew what they were dealing with. A child who had been beaten, abused, and neglected for far too long. The injuries told a story, a horrific truth that her mother would soon try to deny. They wasted no time. The police were called. When detectives arrived at the hospital, the sight of Ellie was enough to make even the most experienced among them pause. Officers had been in this line of work long enough to recognize what they were looking at. They had seen victims of accidents, cases where a child had fallen, where a genuine tragedy had taken place. This was not that. Ellie's condition did not match the excuses her mother would later provide. Her wounds were too extensive, too severe, and too prolonged. This was not the result of a single injury. This was the outcome of consistent, relentless harm. The detectives turned their attention to Cheyenne Hill, expecting a mother who was inconsolable, a woman wrecked with grief, desperate for answers, pleading with them to help her daughter. But what they found was something else entirely. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging them to save her child. She wasn't panicked, asking if Ellie would survive. Instead, she was calm. She sat quietly, her expression neutral, her tone measured. And then, when she finally spoke, the words that left her mouth were as cold as the body of the child she had brought in. She fell off the bed. It was said casually, as if she were explaining a minor inconvenience rather than the brutal reality of a dying toddler. The detectives exchanged glances, already sensing something was off. She was just tired, Cheyenne continued. She snored a lot. Her voice never wavered. There was no emotion, no distress, no sign of a mother who had just lost her only child. The lead investigator, Detective Jim Sloan, had interviewed countless suspects in his career. He had seen people lie, watched them shift uncomfortably as they struggled to keep their stories straight. Cheyenne wasn't like them. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stammer. It was as if she had already rehearsed her answers before they ever asked the questions. And that was their first red flag. As the interview continued, the inconsistencies began to pile up. Detectives asked when Ellie had last been responsive. Cheyenne claimed it had been that morning, but then later changed her story, saying she had been unresponsive since the night before. They asked about the bruises on Ellie's face. Cheyenne shrugged them off, saying, "She falls a lot." They questioned why she didn't take Ellie to the hospital sooner, why she had left for work while her child lay motionless in bed. She didn't have an answer for that one. She just stared at them, silent for the first time. Then came the second red flag. While Cheyenne sat there, emotionless, another team of detectives were digging into her past. It didn't take long to find the CPS reports. 6 days before Ellie was brought into the hospital, Child Protective Services had received a report about Cheyenne. The allegations were serious: drug use in the home, a strong chemical smell coming from her apartment, bruises on Ellie's face. The call had been made. The warning had been given. And nothing had been done. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they spoke to those who had been in Ellie's life, the babysitter, the neighbors, the people who had noticed the red flags but hadn't been able to stop what was happening. One by one, they described the same disturbing behavior. Cheyenne never spoke about Ellie with affection. She called her ugly, mocked her, compared her to a serial killer. She would throw food on the floor and force Ellie to eat it, calling it free roaming. She didn't care if the bruises were obvious. She didn't care if people noticed. And now, here she was, sitting in an interrogation room, acting like none of it mattered. For the detectives, the case was already beginning to take shape. Ellie Plummer had suffered for most of her short life. The bruises, the broken bones, the neglect, it had all been leading to this moment. And now, it was time to find out just how far Cheyenne Hill was willing to go to avoid the truth. The interrogation wasn't over, but the walls around Cheyenne were beginning to close in. What should CPS have done differently to prevent this tragedy? Comment below. Because for Ellie, help had come too late. And soon, Cheyenne would have to answer for every second of suffering she had inflicted. Ellie had been dead for less than 24 hours when the autopsy results began to confirm what detectives already suspected. This was not an accident. This was not a case of a toddler falling from a bed. The injuries told a different story, a story of pain, of repeated violence, of a child who had suffered for far longer than anyone had realized. The medical examiner's report was brutal in its detail. Ellie's cause of death was fatal head trauma, a brain bleed caused by forceful impact. But that wasn't all. Her collarbone had been broken. Her face showed signs of repeated blunt force injuries. Her tiny body was covered in bruises, many in different stages of healing. This meant the abuse had not just happened that night. It had been ongoing. There was no medical condition that could explain these injuries, no single accident that could have caused such extensive damage. Someone had done this to Ellie. And now, detectives needed to make Cheyenne Hill admit the truth. She sat in the interrogation room, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. She had already told her story. Ellie had fallen off the bed. She had been tired. She had snored a lot. But detectives weren't finished. They turned up the pressure. Ellie didn't die from a fall, one of them said. We have the autopsy results. The injuries don't match your story. Cheyenne didn't react the way they expected. She didn't gasp. She didn't break down in tears. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering her next move. Then, she did what most guilty people do when they feel the weight of evidence pressing down on them. She shifted the blame. I wasn't the only one with her, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. Maybe something happened when she was with Michelle. Michelle, the babysitter. She had bruises when I picked her up from Michelle's house, Cheyenne continued. She told me nothing happened, but how do I know that's true? The detective across from her leaned forward, watching her carefully. Michelle wasn't with Ellie the night she died, he pointed out. You were. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed Cheyenne's face. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to people pushing back. She was fine when I left her with Cameron, she said instead. Maybe you should be looking at him. Now, it was Cameron's turn to be thrown under the bus. The same man she had left Ellie with while she went to work. The same man who had called her, urging her to come home because something was wrong. She was already sick when I got home, Cheyenne insisted. Cameron was the one watching her. Maybe he did something. The detective shook his head. She was already dying when he called you, he said. You were the one who ignored her cries the night before. You were the one who left her in that bed and went to work. Cheyenne didn't like that answer. She shifted again, this time changing her tactic. She started using medical terms, trying to sound knowledgeable, trying to take control of the conversation. She was posturing, she said suddenly. That's why she looked stiff. It's a neurological response, right? A symptom of a brain injury. It was an odd statement for someone with no medical background. The kind of detail that suggested she had looked it up, that she had been trying to prepare for this exact conversation. The detective narrowed his eyes. You seem to know a lot about brain injuries, he said slowly. Why is that? Cheyenne shrugged. I read a lot. Or maybe, the detective pressed, you knew exactly what was happening to Ellie, and you still chose to leave her there. For the first time, Cheyenne didn't have a response. They had her cornered, but there was still one thing missing. The motive. Why? Why would a mother do this to her own child? That answer came from the people who knew Cheyenne best. Co-workers. Friends. People who had heard her talk about Ellie in ways that no mother ever should. Cheyenne had been open about her frustrations with motherhood. She had told people she didn't want to be a parent. She had complained about Ellie being too needy, too demanding, too much of a burden. But there was one comment, one chilling statement that revealed the truth about what had really happened. One of her co-workers remembered it clearly. She said she thought her boyfriend would marry her if she didn't have a kid. The room fell silent when that statement was read aloud. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional. Cheyenne believed that Ellie was the only thing standing in the way of the life she wanted. She thought that without a child, Cameron would finally commit to her. She was willing to sacrifice Ellie for her own selfish desires. And the most chilling part? She had admitted it. Another co-worker recalled her saying something even worse. She told me Ellie was better off dead. Those were her words. Not spoken in grief. Not spoken in regret. Spoken as if her own daughter's death was a relief. The detective had heard enough. He sat forward, his patience wearing thin, his voice hardening. A mother's job is to protect her child, he said. You did the opposite. Cheyenne didn't react. She had been trying to control the conversation, to manipulate the narrative, to deflect, to stall. But now, all the lies had collapsed. The evidence was against her. The autopsy was against her. The witness statements were against her. There was no way out. And for the first time since the investigation began, Cheyenne Hill had nothing left to say. Do you think her boyfriend should have been held responsible too? Let us know. Because while the detectives had finally broken Cheyenne's lies apart, there was still one question left to answer. Had Cameron truly been unaware of what was happening? Or had he simply chosen to look the other way? That was something the court would have to decide. But for Cheyenne Hill, the truth had finally caught up to her. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. The weight of Ellie's death hung heavy over the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, a room filled with people who had followed every painful detail of the case, who had seen the photos, read the reports, and heard the horrifying words spoken by the one person meant to protect her. The trial of Cheyenne Hill was not just about the legal consequences of her actions, it was about justice for Ellie, about accountability for a life that had been cut short far too soon. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out the facts. Ellie had died from fatal head trauma, the result of prolonged and intentional abuse. Her broken collarbone, her swollen face, the multiple bruises in various stages of healing, none of it was consistent with a simple fall from a bed, as Cheyenne had claimed. The medical examiner testified that Ellie had suffered for weeks, possibly months, and that her final moments had been agonizing. The brain bleed that ultimately took her life was not an accident. It had been caused by force, a force strong enough to leave a child unresponsive, a force that had gone untreated for hours before anyone bothered to seek medical attention. And then, there were the statements from those who knew Cheyenne best. The babysitter, Michelle Merrow, took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the bruises she had seen, the excuses Cheyenne had given, the words that had haunted her ever since Ellie died. She never loved that child, Michelle said. She treated her like she was nothing. Co-workers followed, recalling the disturbing way Cheyenne spoke about Ellie. She called her ugly, one witness testified. She said she reminded her of Jeffrey Dahmer, another added. And then, the statement that silenced the courtroom. She told me Ellie was better off dead. It was that moment, the moment where those words echoed through the courtroom, where the reality of what had happened became impossible to ignore, that sealed Cheyenne's fate. The defense had little to work with. Cheyenne's attorney attempted to paint her as a struggling mother, overwhelmed, addicted, incapable of making rational decisions. They tried to shift blame to Cameron, to Michelle, to a failing system that had overlooked warning signs. But no amount of excuses could erase the facts. She had choices. She had time to save Ellie. She chose to do nothing. And then, she had tried to lie her way out of it. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty. On all counts. Child neglect resulting in death. Aggravated battery. Failure to seek medical care. The sentencing hearing was equally devastating. The judge, someone who had seen their fair share of tragedy, of broken families, of horrific cases, did not hold back. They turned to Cheyenne, who sat motionless at the defendant's table, her expression vacant, her hands folded in her lap. This court has seen negligence, the judge said. This court has seen parents make mistakes. This is not that. This is intentional cruelty. This is a mother who heard her child cry in pain and did nothing. This is a mother who had the opportunity to seek help and chose not to. The judge's voice hardened. You have shown no remorse, no grief, no acknowledgement of what you have done. And now, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars, just as Ellie spent her final moments, alone. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The media picked apart every detail of Cheyenne's case, calling it one of the most disturbing cases of child neglect in recent history. Social media was flooded with outrage, people demanding answers, asking how a child could slip through the cracks so many times before it was too late. And then, there was the question of Cameron Fleming. Had he been just another bystander, someone who looked the other way until it was too late? Or had he been complicit? Authorities ultimately decided that Cameron had not directly participated in the abuse but had failed to act when it mattered most. He was never charged, but his reputation was forever ruined. People didn't forget. People knew. They knew he had lived in that house. They knew he had seen the bruises. They knew he had been there, the night Ellie cried in pain, and he did nothing. Even without a prison sentence, his punishment would follow him for the rest of his life. The babysitter, Michelle, faced no legal consequences, but the guilt haunted her. She had known something was wrong. She had seen the signs. And yet, it hadn't been enough. She had reported what she saw, but nothing had changed. She spent years questioning whether she could have done more. Wondering if a second phone call, another complaint, a stronger push for intervention could have saved Ellie. She would never know. And that was something she would carry with her forever. As for Cheyenne, life behind bars didn't change her. She continued to deny responsibility, continued to play the victim, telling fellow inmates that she had been unfairly targeted, misunderstood, framed. She never spoke Ellie's name. She never admitted what she had done. To this day, she refuses to acknowledge that she killed her own child, but the world remembers. Ellie Plummer should have had a lifetime ahead of her. She should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, built a future. Instead, she became another child failed by the very people meant to protect her. Her name is not forgotten. Her story is not ignored. And the question remains, how many more warnings must go unheard before we stop another tragedy like this from happening again? Do you believe Cheyenne's sentence was harsh enough? What would you have given her? Let us know. Because justice was served in a courtroom. But for Ellie, it came far too late. She never had a chance to grow up. She never got to experience the simple joys of childhood, the excitement of birthdays, the thrill of running through a playground, the warmth of a bedtime story read by a parent who loved her. She never got to walk through the doors of a classroom for the first time, never had the opportunity to make friends, to dream, to carve out a future that was meant to be hers. Instead, she spent her short life longing for affection she would never receive, enduring pain no child should ever know, suffering in silence while the world around her failed to act. And now, she is another name on a growing list of children lost to abuse, another face in a heartbreaking collection of lives that ended too soon. But her story doesn't have to fade into the background. The details may be difficult to hear. The reality may be uncomfortable. But we cannot turn away. We must ask ourselves the hard questions. Why wasn't Ellie saved? How many other children are out there right now, trapped in homes where no one is listening, where no one is stepping in? The warning signs were there. The bruises, the neglect, the cries that went unanswered. There were people who saw the red flags, who suspected something was wrong. Reports were made. Calls were placed. And yet, nothing changed. How do we stop this from happening again? How do we ensure that the next Ellie Plummer is pulled from danger before it's too late? How do we make sure that child protective services, neighbors, teachers, and friends take every warning seriously, that no case of abuse is ever brushed aside as just another sad story? It is not enough to feel outraged after a child is gone. The time to act is before it's too late. Because Ellie will never get a second chance, but the children who are suffering today still can. If this case left you in shock, let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, cases that deserve to be remembered, stories that must be told, hit subscribe. Cheyenne Hill was not the first mother to betray her own child. And she won't be the last. Stay tuned for the shocking case of another woman who did the unthinkable. Because these stories matter. And as long as they continue to happen, they must continue to be told.